Hello and welcome to the Brothers Get In podcast, the show that explores how to create a more prepared, more resilient, and more responsible human being. Presented by two brothers, two ex-special operations brothers, and I am one of them. My name is Stuart.
Stuart. And now I'm Anthony, Dr. Anthony Gadeen, and I'm the older out of the two of us. I like to always call Stuart my little brother, but he's actually bigger than me, taller and towered over me for quite some time now, but I just still like to call him my little brother.
I think by the time I came along, third of three, you were first of three, the family had some more nutritional access, and so I got fed better.
Yeah, you didn't any longer have to fight the dogs for food like the rest of us.
Coincidentally, the milkman was a very tall person, but that's neither here nor there. So today, what are we up to? Episode 6 now. This is going to be one of those kind of slight rant type episodes, or just a waxing lyrical. So if you're not into that, if you're not into just two people talking at each other, then I don't know why you're listening to podcasts, for starters. But this might not be your podcast. But hopefully we should learn some stuff. This is going to be about situational awareness. This is going to be about the theory of how we orientate ourselves towards threats and how we observe the world around us.
Very much so. And yeah, hidden between all the rants, there is a little bit of usable information that we want to give to you today. Situational awareness. It's a really important part of what we talk about, what we try to promulgate, and look, just for life in general.
So I want to start off by asking you a question. If you're walking down the street, any street, anywhere, no, wait, let me make this more specific. If you're walking down a street in Australia, what side of the road would you prefer to walk on?
I would be walking on the right-hand side of the road.
I agree. And I have said this to people, and people argue with me. I've said it on actual courses where I'm teaching, security and teaching, personal awareness, stuff like this. And people go, no, you walk on the left-hand side of the road. And that just doesn't make any sense to me.
No, you drive on the left-hand side of the road, sure. Stay on that side, but you walk on the right-hand side of the road. Why do you walk on the right-hand side of the road?
Well, when I give the explanation of this, it's basically boils down to one main factor, is that I can see the cars coming towards me. So there's nothing driving up behind me that I can't see. And so this leads into a greater theory here on security or self-preservation, survival, about being able to observe threats.
Absolutely. Look, and that is, I think, is some of the key to this, is being able to see a threat, being able to then perhaps respond to your threat. So if you're walking down the left-hand side of the road, a car comes up behind you, maybe it's dark, you can see their headlights, maybe you can just hear them during the day, but there's nothing else you know about that vehicle, how far, how close it's going to be, how big it is. Whereas you're standing on the right-hand side of the road, you can see them coming. You know if they're swerving. You know what direction they're facing, and you may be able to react if they're getting a little bit close to you. But it also hones in really well to one of my primary sort of principles, is facing your fears. Because my feeling is a lot of people walk around there on the left-hand side of the road in life in general because they don't want to face what's coming towards them. It's scary. It's scary when a truck's heading towards you. It's scary when a car or a threat of any type is heading towards you. So I think this fits in very well with the belief that you need to be able to face your fears. And there's good reason for that, which we'll go into now.
Yeah, that's kind of the key point, that I'm asking this question. It's a very specific scenario, but really it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for life. That's the way I think about it, is what side of the road would you prefer to be on? If you were the kind of person you're listening to that question, you go, oh no, I want to be on the left side of the road. Maybe start to ask yourself, why? Why would you want to be on the left side of the road? Do you not want to see what is coming? And you've done a lot of open ocean swimming. I've done a little bit of it because I hate it and I'm in fear of sharks constantly. But you love it because you're a bit of a fish. I remember I was doing some swimming in the ocean, and I kept looking down and putting my head underwater. And somebody was asking me, like, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Oh, just in case there's sharks." And they said, "Why does it matter? You're going to get eaten anyway." And I said, "Oh, I want to see it coming at least." The theory is, if I can see something coming, I can at least do something, as opposed to nothing.
Yeah.
If you don't know something's coming, there is nothing you can do about it.
Absolutely. And look, that sort of principle, like, you need to be able to see it, you need to be able to face your fears to be able to deal with them and get in as close as you can. People moving away, you're not going to know what you can do about it. But I think, yeah, in principle, when I sort of divide people up now, are they left-hand road walkers or are they right-hand road walkers?
Yeah, two kinds of people in the world. When I've taught self-defense type classes as well, sometimes it comes up that people go, "Oh, well, if you act in a way that the person knows that you know they're there, does that not increase the chance that you're going to go into a confrontation?" So what's I'm talking about there is a potential threat enters into the space around you. To give it a scenario, maybe you're hanging out at a bus stop or something like that, and someone who you think, this doesn't feel good, this person looks a bit bad or whatever, is acting weird. Do you, A, stand in a way that you could defend yourself and not necessarily look directly at them, but be able to observe them easily? Or B, bury your head in your phone, ignore that they're there, pretend that you are by yourself, and not engage with that person at all. And I think those two different philosophies on life, there are some people who say to me, like, no, I've done this in the past and I ignored the person and it worked perfectly. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I'm also of the opinion, at least, that if that person had have wanted to do them harm, their ability to react to that would have been limited at best.
Yeah. And look, I think this ability to react, to let that person know that you're watching them, and does that incite them, is sort of the next level in judgment. But I want to ask a question. What do you think about empathy? What's your thoughts? What do you think empathy is?
Weakness.
Interesting. Empathy, I think, is an interesting ideal. I think a lot of people proclaim to have empathy but do not. And why I'm sidetracking this, yes, I'm a doctor and empathy is a big part of my profession. But I didn't learn empathy in medicine. I learned empathy long before. Empathy is the ability to understand what's in the other person's mind that you are looking at. And if you're not looking at them, you're not going to be empathetic to that person at all, whether that's good or bad. You need to look at that person, understand their stance, the way they're looking, and then the way they feel. So what are they going to do and react next? And you can't do that by closing yourself up. You can't do that by turning away, looking into your phone. And I think this empathetic trait is something that we're quite missing these days. And a lot of bad scenarios could be avoided with a little bit more empathy in the world.
Just understanding how somebody might react or what they're thinking, what they're feeling, probably would be the best way to, if you were talking about empathy, with M being emotional. That if you can understand roughly the felt emotion of somebody, you're going to be able to maybe predict what they're going to do. And that's actually, when we're talking about situational awareness, that's one thing that I like to remind people is situational awareness is not just observing what's going on around you. That's the textbook answer, I think, of situational awareness. What's situational awareness? It's observing the environment and the elements within the environment and to see what is actually unfolding around you. But that doesn't necessarily result in any change in my behavior to increase my survivability. That doesn't mean that I'm going to do anything if I just observe something.
Especially when you're dealing with other humans. You need to know what that other human is thinking and feeling, what their purpose is, what their objective or goal is. How would you feel in their shoes? How would you act and react given what they want to do? There's a lot more to it than just observing, but it's reading that situation, particularly when you're dealing with other people.
And reading other human beings is really, I guess, kind of a superpower, but not really a superpower as in it's exclusive. Like everyone, most people, I should say, would have access to this. If you actually think about it, you will be reading people constantly, all day, every day. If you come into contact with people, you'll be able to read what they may do in any given situation.
Yeah. And look, I think it is. There's a lot of opportunity. We get asked this a lot. How do I learn this sort of ability? Now, I think for myself, I personally, Stu might be the same. Our father was a salesman. So he importantly had to have empathy and understand what other people wanted for his business. And so he taught some of that when we were very young. This we've sort of used throughout life, but people ask, like, how do I develop these skills? You look for the opportunities. Every time you interact with someone, every time you do a dealing, you buy something at the shop, you walk past someone, say hello to them. Every interaction is a chance for you to practice that kind of, and I use the word empathy a lot, it's just understanding what the other person is feeling.
Tying this back to where we started here, walking on the side of the road. This is actually something, all this is coming from observed data, is the way I think about it. I'm observing the world around me and I'm collecting information. So I can't accurately predict what another human being, or let's take the human being out of it, a threat. I can't predict what a threat might do or how it might result if I cannot observe it. And that's, again, what walking on the right-hand side of the road, switch that over if you live in the US, I guess, or France, or pretty much anywhere in the world, bar UK or Australia.
Yeah.
But if you're walking on the right-hand side of the road, you can observe that threat. So you're going to be able to perhaps predict it. Let's say a car's coming towards you. You're going to be able to see if it's pulling over, if people are getting out, or if it's swerving towards you to hit you. You can't see any of those things if the car is behind you.
Absolutely. Which I think this sort of reminds me or brings me into the next part of it is observe. What do we do next? And there is a system out there that's highly practiced out there, developed by Air Force crew a long time ago on how they utilise this system during combat. And that's the OODA loop. You would have heard it before in other areas and places, or you've probably heard of us talk about it before, and I have no doubt you'll hear about us talk it again. So the OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, and act. So we couldn't get past the first step before because we're on the wrong side of the road. Now we're on the right side of the road and we're observing what it is. The next step in this phase is to orientate. To orientate, we'll just talk about that for a minute now. So to orientate for me doesn't necessarily mean you facing the right direction. Its orientation means knowing what else is around you. Again, in our scenario of walking down the road, a threat, a car, something's heading down in our general direction. Orientate. Where is the road and our walking path compared to them? Is there a ditch or a bolster that we can hide behind should that car start to move into our pathway? What else is behind me that I need to know? What else is to the left or right of me? That's what we mean by orientate, knowing what's around you.
One other thing I like to put in with orientate is orientating our belief system or our version of reality to the threat that is there. So that what generally happens with human beings is a threat appears, and we don't want that to happen. Most human beings don't want threats coming at them. So the first thing we'll try and do is deny that. We have a version of reality where everything is cool and everything is pretty hunky-dory. So we want to keep that. When something is opposed to that, the first thing we try and do is go, no, that can't be. So it's an acceptance of the threat that is there, an acceptance of an alternate reality that we weren't expecting. So we're reorientating our psychology, our mind, our mindset, or our version of reality to whatever it is that's in front of us.
And I just want to add a bit of balance to that too, is that on the other hand, we can't be threatened by everything that we see. We can't be in that agitated state all the time. But we need to know how to move fluidly from the point of rest to the point of agitation and back into the middle again, or the appropriate amount of agitation.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, if you were actually preset to think that everything was a threat, it would probably result in a freeze response. Like you wouldn't do much, or you probably wouldn't leave your house that much.
So you wouldn't be walking on the side of the road.
You wouldn't be sort of walking on any road, right? So, that's why we construct this reality where everything is okay. So because everything is okay the vast majority of the time. So there's another idea here building on the OODA loop, which is actually called the survival arc, which comes from, I first came across it in a book called The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley. So in that, talking about this arc, there's essentially three things that human beings do when faced with immediate threat, and usually like a life-threatening issue that's come up. The first is denial. So then we have to move through that denial and get to deliberation to make some sort of like decision. And then we get to decision, to actually making a decisive action, everything resulting in action. So it's kind of another way, or a different slant, I guess, on looking at the OODA loop, maybe slightly less militaristic way. You and I tend towards the OODA loop a lot, being militaristic type people. But the end point is some sort of action, but it all comes back down to I can't act appropriately if I can't make a decision on what I need to do. I can't make a decision unless I can orientate myself towards what is actually happening. I can't orientate myself correctly to what's happening if I can't take in the information, observe it. So observe, orient, decide, act.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that decision point, making a decision point too, is really important. So we've gone through the first two phases of observe, orientate. We now need to make a decision, a call, and we make that as part of that information that we've just absorbed, especially part of our orientation. Are we going to continue walking the way we are down the road? Are we going to move off and walk behind the bolster just to give ourselves a little bit of breather protection? Or are we going to leap into the ditch at the last minute? But we need to have those decisions preset so we can act on them quickly. The problem is if we don't make a decision, we'll get lost again in that flight, or freeze position, where we will get stuck in that indecision loop, where we cannot make a decision at the last minute. And it's important to have a pre-decided reaction and action in your head by the time that comes about. Now, none of this actually takes a lot of time. It will initially, for those out there that haven't practiced this before. It'll be a bit mechanical, a bit lumpy, but the more you practice it, the easier and the quicker and automated it becomes. Because our brain loves automated systems because they're energy efficient. And at the end of the day, our bodies and our mind want to be energy efficient.
Yeah, which is part of the reason why we don't immediately go, oh, there's a threat, quick, react to it, is because, like I was saying, we have to reconstruct our reality. And that takes a lot of energy to do. It's also kind of psychologically painful to be walking around with a loose version of reality. We need borders, we need order, we need boundaries, we need structure within our brains to not go mad, I guess. So we build those things, but then it's hard when something is counter to that, i.e. I work in a very high, tall building, and I just watched the second tower of that building take a hit from a plane. Regardless if you think that was real or not, or I think it was an inside job by the CIA, I don't really care. But, you just saw that happen. And this is actually some of the stories that are outlined in that book, The Unthinkable, where people went, oh, that's a strange occurrence. And they went to leave, and then they came back to their desk and they grabbed their novel. And then they went to leave and they came back and they grabbed a pot plant off their desk. And they spent minutes and minutes and minutes, and we're talking like 10, 20, 30 minutes, faffing around in a loop where they could not make a decision because they did not have a version of reality where a plane could fly into their building. So they just could not accept it, that it was happening. And without that reorientation, without that acceptance, unfortunately, those people, more often than not, did not make it out of those towers. So the idea that nothing bad will ever happen can actually be quite disadvantageous from a survival standpoint.
Yeah, and as long as, and I think that, look, I personally don't think that people actually end up in this thing where they think nothing bad will happen. I think it's a more defensive mechanism of they think bad things can happen. The best way for my brain to hide for it is to think nothing bad will happen. And yet that's where we come back to it. I think facing your fears is very important. Having a look at things that could be a potential threat in your day-to-day life. And we've had some exceptional circumstances come out lately in Australia as well, where threats that we never thought would happen have occurred in the last year or so. I.e. the recent stabbings up at the in Sydney.
Yeah, Bondi Junction, the mall there.
Yeah. So people never thought in a month of Sundays anything like that would happen. Yet it does happen. And it doesn't mean that you never go to the mall, but you just need to go to the mall and be aware that that's a remote possibility and just have it in your back of the mind. So that sort of brings around, we've talked a little bit about the decision process. I think when we're looking at the ACT process, when we look under ACT, most people go, when I see things under threat, usually we like to categorise it as fight, flight or freeze. So some people will put their knuckles up if they get scared. Some people will just turn it and run blindly. And some people just freeze on the spot. These are inbuilt reactions, mostly. And they're very generalised as well. There's lots of various variations of them. But they're not the end of the day. And I think what we can do is we can build our own reactions within the system. Reactions that can become spontaneous, that can happen very quickly, but they must be prepared through training. The first bit of training you can do is thinking about it, visualization, and then later perhaps some practice or some practical training in those environments to know how you react and then adapting or adjusting to it until they now become your inbuilt reaction, a new reaction imposed over the top. So humans are built with these reactions with them to try and mitigate most threats and problems, and that's good. But throughout life, we need to build our own set of instant reactions. And these reactions will become very primal. They won't be thought about. They'll just be done, which you need in a very fast response.
One of my good friends for a while, I used to train with him, as in we used to do courses together. He used to say all the time that we have hundreds of thousands of years of survival technology built, like evolved within our own being, just by the fact that we're here, that we know we're here, and there was a lineage for us to get here, and all those ancestors of ours had to survive, some of them in extreme arduous conditions compared to what we have today. And so now we live in a very novel environment where we don't have to access that survival very often, but it's still there. We just have to remind the body how to use it. It's kind of like there's a map to use it, and we've lost the map a little bit. So we need to dust off that map and re-walk those steps every now and then.
Absolutely. I mean, anything you do, like any sort of learning, anything like neurological systems that are set up, there's no 100% hardwiring. They can be overridden. The mind is super plastic. And he's right, they are there, but if they're not utilised much throughout life, then you're just going to have to rely on what is there, and it might not be perfect for that particular situation. It's like any muscle, though. You need to exercise that mind.
That's quite often how I think about it, is by going through this sort of stuff, it's going to make you statistically more likely to enact something if you think about it, if you train it, if you actually do it. So the continuum that I usually use is, first off, no acceptance of threat. That's the worst scenario you could be in, and then a threat appears. That you had no concept that this could be a threat, and then it's suddenly there. Imagine, I don't know, your favorite alien film or something. You're walking down the street and all of a sudden this thing jumps out in front of you that's 20 foot tall and is tearing people apart. Like, you've just got no concept of that unless you're into sci-fi like I am. So I'm waiting for it. But you've got no concept of that, so you're probably going to freeze. Most people would probably freeze coming across that. Then the next part is acceptance of threat. So it's actually going and looking at realistically what threats are in your environment potentially and going, okay, well, this could happen. And then just leaving it there, because your subconscious brain will actually start to build plans around that. So I like to say that that's going to make you statistically more likely to enact in an appropriate way in a survival situation. From there, then there's creating an actual plan. So taking it from the subconscious and going, no, I'll consciously think of a plan of action. And then from there is preparation and practice of that plan, i.e. training. And I think that is really the pinnacle. Well, maybe there's one more. You could then go out and put yourself in harm's way and practice it in a realistic sense. But that's
close to training.
Yeah.
But
I think training is what most of us will have access to.
Yeah.
That's going to make you most likely to react in a more appropriate way in an emergency situation.
Which I think, that's what it boils down to, is that being able to act in an appropriate fashion at the end of the day. Yes, starting off with knowing that which side of the road you're going to walk on, making sure that you're facing the problem, that you understand the problem that's in front of you, and that you have an appropriate reaction to that. And rehearsals and practice are the keys to do this. There's no secret way or no easy way about it. I think that's pretty much as much.
This actually popped into my head because I was actually walking down the street the other day on the right-hand side of the road. And I thought about it, and people who have asked me in the past, like, why would you do that? Why don't you walk on the left-hand side? And then it made me think, where did this start? And we were chatting about this just before. When we did scouts as kids, that's the first time I remember actually being taught this, and not necessarily taught, hey, you got to walk on the right-hand side of the road because of this. It was just walk on the right-hand side of the road. And it wasn't until we'd done it for a while, and then I said, why do we do this? And they explained why we did it. I'm like, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't secret, like, special forces training or anything. This is something we were actually taught as kids, and most people I think, have access to this at least when they're kids. Just don't really carry it on to our adult life.
Yeah. And look, I mean, maybe Scouts was a little bit different now than it was back then. But, I mean, got a lot of good lessons from Scouts. Like the old motto, be prepared. Loved it. Still use it today. Use it every day in between. Be prepared for that next, whatever's coming up. From walking on the right-hand side of the road to carrying the 40 cents in your pocket to make that emergency phone call. I don't know if that'll work very well these days, but
I think they're free, aren't they, now?
Yeah, they're all free now, and the only people that use payphones are drug dealers, but that's another story. To having a notebook and pen in your pocket, and a hanky, simply carrying a hanky that can be used for all manner of devices, can be used to wrap wounds, to clean things up, to hold things together. Just little things like that. I really bring that all back down to our basic training back in Scouts.
I wonder where the Scouts are at now.
I feel like they're a totally different beast these days.
Probably pretty similar to the Army.
Yes, totally different beast.
From all reports that I've had of people who've got in recently, and other friends that I've got that are still in, that it has changed. That's about the nicest thing I can say.
Different culture, different era.
Yeah, which is interesting, because if you look at why the Scouts came about, Sir Baden Powell came back from war and said, like, we're not ready. We're not, as a society, ready for the rigors of war. And so I want to help bridge that gap by not necessarily training people in war, but training kids to be more hardy. to be tougher, to know the basic things that he thought every kid should know.
I find it interesting that these things come around in cycles. I'm pretty sure someone would have done that before him. I think we're due for another reawakening, rehardening, because we've just come out of a rather intense period. And I think, look, you say ready for war, but ready for everyday life. Like, I don't think we even need to get to the battlefield. We just need people that are ready for everyday life. And if you're ready for everyday life, you should be ready for war.
Yeah. A couple of things popped into my mind there. One was the fires of 2019, 2020, which I was pretty involved in because it's my community here and we were under fire, as it were. And the different reaction from different people. Like across the board, it's pretty good reaction because it's a rural town that I live in. Rural town, not rural town. Rural town that I live in. And so people are generally more hardy. However, having said that, there's the rural element and there is the artistic element in my town.
The tree change element.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who, aren't really of the land, salt of the earth type people. They're more from the city and they just wanted a slower pace of life. And so they come out here. And watching the reaction of certain people when faced with this, what was probably pretty close to the first time they've had an existential crisis, I guess, of physical being, that their worldly possessions and sometimes even them could be destroyed very, very quickly. And there's two very different reactions. Across the board, as I was saying, mostly it was very good. And then there was a couple of people who did not deal very well with it, I think, from my opinion at least. And then I want to juxtapose this or give you a reference, the floods in the northern rivers that happened a couple of years later. Just after those floods, I packed up my ute and my chainsaws, and I knew the communities up there because I lived up in around Mullumbimby, the hinterland of Byron Bay for a little while. So I knew people up there and I knew they were kind of hurting and there was people who hadn't been even contacted yet that were trapped or, people couldn't access them. So I thought, I can help here. Drove the ute up with the chainsaws on it and heaps of equipment and gear to hand out to people. Got up there and I was stunned. I was shocked by how people were reacting to that particular emergency. So you've got one emergency that's in a rural town where people are generally very good, and one that's in a hippie town where these people just did not have a concept of bad things happening like in the world. That happens somewhere else in the world. Then these catastrophic floods come through and they killed people, destroyed entire areas, cut people off from civilization for days. And like I literally got up there and I went into what they called the emergency center, and I said, "Hey, I'm here. Here's my background. I've got all these skills. I've got all this equipment. What do you need? Where can I go?" And the person looked at me and said, we need somebody to hold a stop sign out the front here because people are going pretty fast past the emergency center." And I said, "Yeah, I'm probably not going to do that, man. I'm probably just going to find some other stuff to do." But to me, it just showed like that concept that I'm talking about. Like they don't want to see the bad parts of the world. They don't want to think about the bad parts of the world out there.
And it quite amazed me really because we live in Australia. And if you're not on fire, you're probably being flooded, if not both at the same time. Like, this is not an unusual concept. These are not something that happens rarely. It happens every single year. And to ignore it shows a certain amount of willful ignorance that creates this indecision platform that people get stuck at that you're talking about with the towers before. And one of the main reasons people die in fires and floods and things like that is an indecision. Until it's too late to make a decision, then they get caught in between. So you've got to make a decision early. I had a really good intensive care unit consultant who used to teach about time dilatation. Every indecision you make early on exacerbates every other decision tenfold further down until it becomes a critical mass where you can no longer save a life. And in these kind of things, it might be the life of your own or people that you love. In what he was talking was the work environment, but it's exactly the same as time dilatation every time you do not make a decision. So you need to make a decision and make it early. We live in Australia. You must be prepared because it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, and it's probably not that far away to the next bad fire or flood or whatever.
I like that one. That's quite a cool concept. That's the first time I've like heard it articulated like that, and I enjoyed that. The indecision thing is a big one. I remember getting taught on leadership courses in the military that a bad decision is much better than no decision at all. So we were taught just to make a decision, go with it, and then you can test and adjust from there as it's unfolding. Yeah. But the worst thing you could do is just sit there and do nothing. I think that's what a lot of people might have a hard time wrapping their head around, is that life is a constant conversation, I call it. It's a constant test, n=1 test, that we're constantly going through, and we go, okay, this worked, this did not work. And in my experience at least, the only time where things get really, really catastrophic is when I don't do anything. I don't make the decision. I allow other things to happen. I don't have an active participation or say in what's going on.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, yes, the flip side of that is to rushing in. But rushing in is, again, it might look like a decision, but it's not a decision. And it doesn't have a follow-on effect of the test and adjust and being able to adjust. Making a decision knowing that this might be a good or bad one, but just moving with it and moving.
Yeah, I've explained this in the past, not a lot of people, but some people have a real hard time wrapping their head around it. Like, doing nothing could be your decision, but you've actively made that decision. You've gone, oh, actually, the best thing I could do here, or the decision that I've made to do is actually freeze, as opposed to the freezing that is quite often talked about with the response to emergency situations or sudden threat, fight, flight, or freeze, or whatever model you've looked at, which is probably closer to something called tonic immobility, where you physically cannot move, despite whatever your brain is doing. Your body will not respond.
Yeah, and look, I think that is really important distinction, and it may be hard for some people to get their head around, but look, I'm a big believer of sometimes mindful, watchful waiting for that decision process to become, but you're waiting for a particular point. You know in mind what you're waiting for. You're not just waiting. You know that something's coming, and that's going to push the next decision. It's a very important distinction.
Yeah, one when you're saying that, I'm always thinking, right, how do we practice this? How do you actually take this information and go, now I'm going to get better at this? And the one thing that jumped out at me then is, where have I done this more often than not? Waiting for something to develop, waiting for that moment, I would say is in martial arts. You're waiting for that moment. It's very, very quick. It's very subtle. It's very immediate, but you're not just sitting there punching away, kicking away, slashing away with your sword, whatever it is, the martial art you're doing. You're actually waiting for a specific moment where you see the opening.
Absolutely. And look, we're going to, diverse a little bit into the fighting arts, but where I originally learnt this was reading Bruce Lee's book, Jeet Kune Do, and watching his half attack. So he'd wait for a moment of movement. And what I learnt later on in martial arts is that every movement that someone does, every attack, is actually an opening. So every time you throw a punch or kick, it's an opening, and you're waiting for that half point in between to strike, to hit. But yeah, you're right. It happens at an increased rate in martial arts. And I think we would have seen this on the battlefield as well. It happens exactly the same, of knowing when to act, when to move out of cover, when to return fire, when not, is exactly the same.
A form of patience, perhaps, where you're not just sitting in there and going, okay, this is happening and this is all there is. So I'm being shot at, so I'm I'm fucked. Like, you're sitting there face down in the dirt, digging holes with your eyelids. You know that can't last forever. It's not a great situation, but you're looking for the gap. You're listening to the rhythm of the battle or the fight or whatever's going on, and you're waiting for that moment to do what you need to do.
So have a look. I mean, on the battlefield, that is like, all right, they ran out of bullets. There's a magazine change. They've stopped to look themselves. In a fight, that's, they've run out of steam. They've thrown their combo of kick, punch, kick, punch, kick, punch, and they've stopped. Bang, now is the time to strike.
Yeah, one thing, when I'm teaching active assailant training to people is to try and identify those sorts of elements. Like, they might be sitting there waiting for that shot, or they might be changing a magazine. And changing magazines, that's a good time to, skedaddle, get out of there, start moving, do what you need to do. Or fight back. Or
do whatever you need to. Yeah, you might only not have long, might only have a few seconds, but it's time to move. And you've got to be ready for that time. You've got to be waiting.
Which means you need to be orientated towards the threat. You need to be observant.
And orientated to what else is around you. Because where are you going to run to next?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. I think that's pretty good for today. I don't know if you've got any more points you want to add to that.
Just quickly how, like, if you're listening to this and this is all pretty theoretical because it is a rant, what's some ways that somebody could take this and go, right, how do I actually practice this sort of stuff? How do I practice OODA loop? How do I practice situational awareness?
Start with it simple. Start with the day-to-day sort of interactions as you're walking around. Start with the hypothetical in your mind. If I walked through this alleyway, if I walked through and talked to this person, what could possibly happen and how would I react to it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way. Like, I usually say to people, just have a practice on something that is utterly ineffectual to your life and something that you already know what the outcome is. So, but observe the elements. Go, okay, when this happens, I should see this next, and you probably will see that next. But then once you start to do that, once I start to do that, then I find I'll start to try and predict other things that are a bit out there. I go, well, I've just seen this. I wonder if this will happen next. So it's kind of learning to predict events a little bit.
Yeah. Learning to watch for the patterns. But yeah, start small, start simple, start now.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening to the Brothers Get In podcast. Again, I am Stuart.
And I'm Anthony.
And we will talk at you next time.
See you then.